The lecture hall buzzed with the low hum of intellectual anxiety, a sound peculiar to institutions like Crestwood University's prestigious mathematics department. Sunlight slanted through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over rows of tiered seating filled with bright young minds clutching laptops and textbooks. Before them, Dr. Alistair Finch held court. Renowned, published, and notoriously difficult, Finch was a titan in the world of theoretical calculus, his silver hair and impeccably tailored tweed jacket reinforcing an aura of unshakable academic authority. Today, he paced before a vast whiteboard covered in complex equations, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He had just presented the infamous Finch conundrum, a notoriously intractable problem he'd devised years ago, one that had stumped mathematicians far more seasoned than the graduate students currently staring at it with a mixture of awe and dread. Standing quietly near the back, almost blending into the oak paneling, was Clara Evans. She wasn't a registered student in this advanced seminar. She was an auditor, officially listed as a departmental assistant coordinating guest lectures, a role that allowed her quiet access to the academic stimulation she craved without the pressures of formal enrollment. She wore a simple grey cardigan over a plain white blouse, dark comfortable trousers, and sensible flat shoes. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple clip, and behind her unassuming glasses, her sharp blue eyes followed Finch's equations with an intensity none of the enrolled students matched. At 45, she looked like a kind librarian or perhaps a diligent administrative aide, certainly not someone who belonged in a room grappling with the cutting edge of theoretical mathematics. Dr. Finch surveyed the room, enjoying the palpable sense of intellectual struggle. "As you can see," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large hall, "the tertiary derivation presents complexities. Even seasoned minds find it challenging." He paused for effect. "It requires not just knowledge, but a certain intuition, a spark." His gaze swept the room, dismissing the furrowed brows of his actual students before landing, seemingly by chance, on Clara near the back. A condescending smile touched his lips. He saw her simple attire, her quiet presence, the slight age difference setting her apart. An idea, cruel and self-aggrandizing, formed in his mind. He would use her to demonstrate the sheer difficulty of the problem, to underscore his own brilliance by showcasing the inevitable failure of someone clearly out of their depth. "Perhaps," he said, his voice suddenly adopting a tone of mock curiosity, "we need a fresh perspective, someone unburdened by preconceived notions." He gestured towards Clara. "You, madam, by the door. You've been observing quietly. What are your thoughts on the conundrum?" Clara looked up, momentarily surprised to be addressed. A few students turned, following Finch's gesture, their expressions ranging from confusion to faint amusement. Who was this woman? What could she possibly offer? Clara simply replied, "It's an interesting structural approach, Professor." Her voice was soft, calm. Finch chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Interesting indeed. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate. Come up to the board. Show us your fresh perspective." He waved her forward with theatrical generosity, fully expecting her to blush, stammer, and decline, thereby proving his point about the problem's difficulty and her own inadequacy. The room watched, a collective holding of breath, waiting for the anticipated embarrassment. But Clara didn't blush. She didn't stammer. She simply nodded, placed the folder she was holding onto an empty seat, and began walking calmly towards the front of the lecture hall, her sensible shoes making almost no sound on the worn wooden floor. The professor's smirk widened. This was going even better than he'd planned. The spectacle of her inevitable failure would be a lesson in itself. As Clara walked towards the front, a ripple of whispers spread through the lecture hall. Students exchanged glances, some curious, some openly smirking. "Is he serious?" a young man in the front row muttered to his neighbor. "She looks like she handles the departmental coffee runs." His neighbor, a woman with bright pink hair and multiple piercings, snickered softly. "This is Finch's idea of humor, I guess. Humiliate the admin staff to make us feel slightly less stupid." Another student further back pulled out his phone, discreetly starting to record. "This might actually be funny," he texted a friend. Professor Finch just called up some random older woman to solve the conundrum. Dr. Finch watched Clara approach, his expression one of amused condescension. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. "Take your time, madam," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall. "There's no rush. We wouldn't want you to feel pressured." The underlying mockery was obvious to everyone, eliciting a fresh wave of stifled chuckles from the students. He gestured towards the whiteboard, already covered in his dense, complex equations. "Feel free to use any available space, though I doubt you'll need much." Clara reached the front and calmly picked up a black dry erase marker from the tray beneath the board. She ignored the whispers, the smirks, the palpable expectation of failure that filled the room. Her focus narrowed, tuning out the distractions. She looked only at the intimidating sprawl of equations that represented the Finch conundrum, her blue eyes scanning the intricate web of symbols and functions. She wasn't looking at it as an impossible task, but as a structure, a system with underlying logic, however complex. Her mind, a place few people had ever glimpsed, began to work, processing the variables, identifying the implicit assumptions, tracing the flow of the derivation. To the onlookers, she simply stood there, silent and unassuming in her simple clothes, a stark contrast to the intellectual fireworks expected in this elite academic setting. Finch cleared his throat pointedly. "Any initial thoughts?" he prompted, his tone dripping with impatience disguised as encouragement. "Or perhaps you require a moment to gather yourself." He was laying the groundwork for her failure, making it seem inevitable, a result of the problem's inherent difficulty rather than his own deliberate act of putting her on the spot. Clara didn't respond verbally. Instead, she lifted the marker, uncapped it with a soft click, and turned towards a small, clear section of the whiteboard, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The lecture hall fell completely silent. Even the smirks faded slightly, replaced by a tense anticipation. What would she do? Scribble nonsense? Draw a blank? Walk away in defeat? The quiet confidence in her simple posture was unnerving, unexpected. It didn't fit the narrative Finch had so carefully constructed. Clara placed the marker tip against the smooth white surface. For a moment, she simply stood there, marker poised, her eyes tracing a path through Finch's equations. The silence stretched, becoming almost heavy. Students shifted uncomfortably. Finch tapped his fingers impatiently on his desk, his smirk faltering into a frown of slight irritation. Was she going to just stand there? Was this some kind of passive protest? "Well, Ms." He trailed off, realizing he didn't even know her last name. "Evans," Clara supplied quietly without turning around. Then her hand began to move. It wasn't the hesitant, uncertain movement Finch had expected. Her writing was fluid, elegant, precise. She didn't start by trying to directly tackle Finch's final complex derivation. Instead, she wrote a single, concise equation near the top corner, a foundational theorem Finch hadn't explicitly used, though it underpinned the entire field. A few students who recognized it exchanged confused glances. What was she doing? Below it, she wrote another theorem, then a lemma, her marker flowing smoothly across the board. She wasn't solving Finch's problem directly yet. She seemed to be laying down groundwork, establishing a different framework. Finch watched, his frown deepening. This wasn't the expected flailing. It was structured, but surely it was irrelevant. "Ms. Evans," he interrupted, unable to contain his impatience, "while a review of basic principles is always refreshing, the crux of the conundrum lies in the specific manipulation of these higher-order derivatives." He pointed towards his own complex scrawl. "Are you suggesting an alternative approach?" Clara paused her writing only for a second. "Not alternative, Professor," she replied calmly, her back still to the room. "Complementary. Your derivation contains an implicit assumption about the boundary conditions that isn't strictly necessary, which leads to the apparent intractability." She then drew an arrow from one of her foundational equations towards a specific point in Finch's work and wrote a short annotation beside it. A gasp rippled through the front row. One student, the sharp young woman with pink hair, whispered urgently to her neighbor, "She's right. That assumption is conditional. We all missed it. Finch's face tightened. He stepped closer to the board, peering intently at Clara's annotations. His expression shifted from irritation to grudging curiosity, then to dawning disbelief. He saw the logic in her framing, the subtle flaw in his own premise that she had exposed with just a few lines. It couldn't be. His conundrum was built on that assumption. Without it, he watched momentarily speechless as Clara moved on, her marker now flying across the board, building upon her initial framework with astonishing speed and clarity. Complex integrations, tensor manipulations, abstract vector spaces, concepts that had his graduate students sweating, flowed from her marker with effortless grace. The room was utterly silent now, the earlier mockery replaced by stunned awe. Students leaned forward, their eyes glued to the board, trying desperately to follow the elegant, rapid-fire logic unfolding before them. Who was this woman? Clara's marker danced across the whiteboard, a blur of black ink against the stark white surface. Equations bloomed, interconnected, flowed into one another with an almost musical rhythm. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was dissecting it, reassembling it, revealing its underlying structure with breathtaking elegance. She navigated treacherous mathematical terrain, multi-dimensional manifolds, non-linear partial differential equations, stochastic calculus, with a familiarity that spoke not just of knowledge, but of deep, intuitive understanding. Her handwriting remained perfectly legible, each symbol precise, each step logically following the last. She occasionally paused, not out of hesitation, but seemingly to choose the most elegant path forward from several viable options. At one point, she erased a small section of Finch's original work, a section containing a minor but persistent calculation error that had likely contributed to its perceived difficulty, and replaced it with a corrected, more streamlined formulation, all without breaking stride. A collective intake of breath went through the students who recognized the correction. Finch himself stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of pale shock. His condescension had evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. This wasn't just competence, it was mastery. The simple woman he had chosen for public humiliation was navigating his life's work, the notoriously difficult Finch conundrum, with a speed and clarity that surpassed his own. He recognized the techniques she was using. Some were standard advanced calculus, but others were drawn from more esoteric branches of theoretical physics and abstract algebra, woven together in a way he had never conceived. Where had she learned this? Who could possibly possess this level of integrated knowledge? He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He hadn't just underestimated her, he had fundamentally misjudged everything. The students were mesmerized. Laptops were forgotten. Whispers ceased. They were witnessing something extraordinary, a display of raw intellectual power that transcended titles, appearances, and academic pedigrees. The young man who had started recording was still filming, his hand trembling slightly, capturing the equations filling the board, the quiet focus of the woman writing them, and the stunned, almost broken expression on Professor Finch's face. In less than 15 minutes, Clara reached the final line. She wrote the solution, a surprisingly compact and elegant expression, and underlined it neatly. Then she added one final equation beneath it, a corollary extending the solution to a more generalized case, something even Finch hadn't considered. She capped the marker with a soft click and placed it back in the tray. Clara turned away from the whiteboard, the elegant solution hanging in the air behind her like a definitive statement. She faced the lecture hall, her expression calm, her blue eyes clear behind her glasses. The room was utterly silent, frozen in a state of collective shock. Students stared, mouths agape, processing the intellectual whirlwind they had just witnessed. Dr. Alistair Finch looked ashen, his usual air of authority completely gone, replaced by a raw, visible vulnerability. He stared at the solution on the board, then at Clara, then back at the board, as if unable to reconcile the two. The Finch conundrum, his impenetrable fortress of intellectual pride, had been solved elegantly and swiftly by the unassuming woman he had tried to ridicule. I don't understand," Finch stammered, his voice barely a whisper, stripped of its usual booming confidence. "How? Where did you study this?" Clara adjusted her glasses slightly. "My background isn't relevant, Professor," she said politely, though a subtle edge had entered her voice. "The mathematics is what matters. Your initial assumption about the boundary conditions was, as I noted, overly restrictive. Removing that constraint simplifies the integration significantly." She gestured towards the board. "The corollary simply addresses the potential for chaotic behavior in non-Euclidean space, which the original problem didn't account for but is a logical extension." Her explanation was concise, precise, and utterly devastating to Finch's intellectual ego. It wasn't just that she had solved it. She had improved upon it, exposed its limitations. The student with the pink hair suddenly stood up, unable to contain herself. "That was brilliant," she exclaimed, her voice ringing in the silence. "Absolutely brilliant. The way you linked the tensor analysis with the stochastic elements. I've never seen it done like that." Her outburst broke the spell. A wave of murmurs swept the room. "Incredible. Who is she? Did you see that integration technique?" The students weren't laughing now. They were buzzing with genuine intellectual excitement, their earlier mockery forgotten, replaced by awe and intense curiosity. Finch flinched as if struck by each whispered comment. He looked utterly lost, his reputation, built on the supposed unsolvability of his conundrum, crumbling around him in real time. He had been publicly undone by the very person he chose to humiliate. The whispers grew louder, turning into excited chatter. Students were comparing notes, pointing at sections of the board, discussing the implications of Clara's solution. The atmosphere had transformed from tense expectation of failure to energized intellectual discovery. Clara simply picked up her folder from the seat where she'd left it. "Doctor," Finch finally seemed to regain some semblance of composure, though his face remained pale. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice strained but regaining a fraction of its formality. "That was unexpected. Clearly your perspective is quite unique." He struggled for words. "Perhaps you would care to elaborate on your background after all, for the benefit of the students, of course." He was attempting to regain control, to frame her brilliance as an anomaly he could study, rather than a refutation of his own status. Clara looked at him steadily. "Professor," she said, her tone still calm, but now carrying an undeniable weight. "My background is that I hold doctorates in both theoretical mathematics and quantum physics from Caltech, completed my postdoctoral work under Dr. Thorne at MIT focusing on multidimensional calculus, and published extensively in the late 90s under my maiden name, before stepping back from academia to pursue other interests and, more recently, support my family." Each qualification landed like a hammer blow. Caltech, MIT, Dr. Thorne, a Nobel laureate Finch himself revered, published extensively. The students gasped. The pink-haired girl sank back into her seat, looking utterly stunned. The young man who had been recording quickly lowered his phone, his face flushing with embarrassment. Finch staggered back a step, his hand gripping the edge of his desk for support. He stared at Clara, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a departmental assistant, but as a peer, potentially even his superior in terms of raw intellectual power and accomplishment, someone whose published work he had likely cited without ever connecting it to the quiet woman auditing his seminar. The full weight of his arrogance, his dismissive judgment based entirely on her simple clothes and quiet demeanor, crashed down upon him. He hadn't just insulted a guest, he had publicly humiliated a genius in his own field, potentially one of the great minds of her generation, who had simply chosen a different path. The silence that followed was profound, filled only by the sound of Finch's ragged breathing. Clara gave a small, polite nod towards the stunned professor and the awestruck students. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, "I have other duties to attend to." She turned and walked towards the exit at the back of the lecture hall, her steps just as calm and unhurried as when she had entered. The students parted respectfully as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of admiration and shame for their earlier complicity in Finch's mockery. No one spoke. No one dared. As she reached the door, the pink-haired student called out hesitantly, "Dr. Evans, wait!" Clara paused, looking back kindly. "Thank you," the student said earnestly. "That was the most incredible lecture I've ever witnessed." Several other students murmured agreement. Clara offered a faint, genuine smile. "Keep questioning assumptions," she advised gently. "That's where the real mathematics begins." And with that, she slipped out of the hall, leaving behind a room fundamentally altered. Dean Defeing. Finch remained frozen by the whiteboard, staring at the elegant equations that had dismantled his reputation. His career, built on intellectual dominance and the carefully crafted myth of the unsolvable conundrum, now felt impossibly fragile. He had flown too close to the sun, blinded by his own arrogance and been burned by the quiet brilliance he had utterly failed to recognize. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of his public downfall, orchestrated not by malice but by the simple, undeniable truth of mathematics, brought forth by a woman he had judged unworthy. The equations on the board seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, a testament to a genius hidden in plain sight. The aftermath within the Crestwood University Mathematics Department was swift, though handled with academic discretion. Dr. Alistair Finch, facing the undeniable evidence of his flawed conundrum and the profound embarrassment of his public misjudgment of Dr. Clara Evans, whose legendary early publications under her maiden name were quickly rediscovered and circulated among faculty and students, requested an immediate sabbatical. Rumors circulated that his return to teaching, especially advanced seminars, was uncertain. His aura of infallibility was shattered, replaced by whispers about his arrogance, and the day he was outclassed by the unassuming auditor. The university administration, alerted to the incident by several students and quietly informed of Dr. Evans's true background, which she had disclosed to the department head years prior when taking the assistant role under strict confidentiality, launched a subtle review of departmental culture, focusing on respect and inclusivity. Clara, meanwhile, continued her work as a departmental assistant, politely declining offers from the university to take on a formal research or teaching position. "I'm content where I am," she told the department head. "My priorities lie elsewhere now." Those priorities included managing the considerable, discreetly held family foundation established by her late husband, which quietly funded numerous scientific research grants and educational programs globally, including, ironically, several projects at Crestwood itself. She continued to audit seminars occasionally, finding joy in the intellectual stimulation, but she rarely spoke up unless directly asked. Her presence, however, was now viewed entirely differently. Students treated her with quiet reverence, often approaching her hesitantly after lectures to ask insightful questions, which she always answered patiently and clearly. The young man who had recorded her now used his channel to discuss her published papers, expressing deep admiration. The pink-haired student became one of her most devoted, albeit informal, disciples, inspired by Clara's quiet brilliance and humility. Clara never sought recognition or apology from Finch. Her victory wasn't over him. It was simply the natural consequence of revealing the truth hidden beneath a simple cardigan and unassuming glasses. She remained Clara Evans, departmental assistant, loving mother, manager of a global foundation, and in the quiet spaces of her own mind, a high IQ genius who had once reshaped the boundaries of theoretical calculus before choosing a different kind of equation to solve. The balance of a life lived with purpose, integrity, and quiet grace, far from the clamor of academic spotlights. If this story celebrating hidden genius and the triumph of substance over superficiality resonated with you, please give it a like, share it with anyone who believes intelligence comes in all forms, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories where quiet brilliance shines through. Thank you for watching.